checking mail. I should do that.
Okay, we are live. This is Senate Finance. We are back. This is, I'm looking at March 12th. This is February 27th. And we're going to continue our discussion on income tax. And Patrick, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so again, Patrick Durkin, my fiscal office. The second document this book should be posted under my name on the page is so principles of big questions. Sorry. And so I guess I'll just give like a quick context before I dive into this. So Senator Beckin and Cummings, you may recognize some of these slides from something Graham had presented to the study committee that looked at earned education income tax in 2022. Was it that summer? So essentially, these slides have been updated for more recent numbers, but the context of it is, Julia will correct me if I'm wrong on anything I say here. At the time, the construct the committee was looking at is what if we eliminated the homestead property tax rate and instead replaced it with a income tax instead. So that's sort of the general, and I just want to mention that because you'll see the way that some of the information is presented is sort of under that specific assumption. That's the structure they were operating on. And I don't think I'm missing anything there, but just because I know this is area of interest for a lot of people right now, a lot of people are talking about it. Just want to stress that nothing I'm about to say is either, cheerleading for or denigrating this idea. It's purely just what I'm going to show you is we're going to look at these two tax types and look at the 6 pillars of a high quality tax system and see where both either succeed in hitting that principle or don't succeed in hitting that principle. And sort of the theme of a lot of it is it's not exactly possible to design a perfect tax code. You're always, no matter what structure you come up with, you're going to be violating in part or in whole certain pillars of this. So a lot of it kind of comes back to, what are your priorities? What do you all think is the best path forward in all of this? But so I guess to start, we'll be looking at sort of its income tax and homestead that we're kind of comparing here. And I just want to also note that I haven't modeled this is what the tax structure needs to look like, or this is how you need to set the tax rate. This is just kind of comparing the overarching themes to hopefully help you inform your conversations about it. But the first one that we want to look at is sustainability and reliability. And these are important because, when we were talking about income tax earlier, we noticed, a lot of our older population is among our higher earners and they're contributing a lot. That's important for something like an education fund. Because you have consistent expenses over time. It's a self-balancing fund. So generally speaking, income taxes are less predictable than property taxes. For the property tax, as the first example, you've got the town that maintains a grand list. That is something that is known to Julia when she goes and works on what the yields should be, and that kind of stuff. The tax base doesn't fluctuate all that much from year to year. You've got your reappraisals that happen, got your construction that might contribute to changes in the underlying the tax base, the grand list. But it is, in the universe of Vermont state taxes, that base right there is very stable and reliable. Like I said, self-balancing fund in this current construct, whenever there is a change that happens, the town's already know, it's already captured within the value, and it can be accounted for on a consistent and transparent basis for the person doing the calculations. And even with the property tax credit, so there's that piece, something like 70% of people receive that credit. It is something that does rely on income. It is an income component of property taxes. But what's different about that calculation compared to personal income taxes is that it's got to look back. So you know already their prior year's income and can base your estimates on that figure. Whereas we talked about with income tax a little bit earlier, there's people who come in and out of some of those higher brackets. People's income can be very dependent on sort of one-time, sales of business or one-time events. So it's not always the most consistent year to year. And so when there's kind of two components of personal income taxes that we kind of think about. The first is withholding. This is sort of what makes paying your personal income taxes smooth over the course of the year. It's fairly consistent, reliable, and knowable. Makes up like 70% of overall personal income tax receipts. But there's that other 30% that is our estimated taxes. It's, if you've got consistent investment income, you're self-employed and earning income from a business, capital gains. That's something that is paid quarterly, like I mentioned, and trued up at the end of the year. But it's difficult to project what that type of income is going to be over the course of the year to know exactly what it's going to be in real time.
I just have a question, or maybe something that just occurred to me about the property tax. I mean, the predictability of it is definitely something that I've heard and also argued myself on some of these things. But I think one of the things that we're seeing right now, and one of the reasons why people are probably more upset than normal about property tax increases, is because it wasn't necessarily predictable, because especially in towns that reappraised, and those are the towns that I've heard from the loudest, is they had a huge property reappraisal that increased their property values significantly, and that bumped up their taxes in a way that they didn't expect. Even though,
if you don't mind, I'd like to refer that to Julia because she knows a heck of a lot more than me.
Sure. Julia Richter, JFO. I have heard that concern, and I think that can be a felt experience by taxpayers when experiencing a reappraisal, because you may see your property value significantly shift from one year to the next. That being said, the CLA is intended to account for the overall tax bill, right? So while you may see that shift in what's appearing in the grand list value, there's a more quiet downward shift in the tax rate to account for that reappraisal. So really the reason that property taxes are increasing is not because, as you know, is not because of a reappraisal or because of shifts in grand list. It's because of an increased need on the property taxes, right? If spending wasn't going up, then property taxes would not need to increase. So the rate could be much lower. And
absolutely, but I think that the combination of the timing of the reappraisal caught a lot of people off guard.
But I think we are seeing the upward spike of housing values. If it follows history, there will be a downward plunge at some point. And we've made adjustments to stagger that so that it doesn't all hit at one time. In theory, if you spend the same amount of money, and your property values go up, you spend the same amount as last year, your rates will come down to raise the same amount of money. If you spend more, then they go up. But within that community, there's always some winners and losers, because some
And that's I'm talking about on the individual, not the aggregate basis, the individual basis.
Yes, you don't care for people whose increase was below average.
Right, of course. I mean,
done
why would they
several
only do that?
tax appeals. I have never seen so many people wanting to downgrade their own homes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
Anyway, okay. So mostly just an observation, not a
Yeah,
question.
but I mean, it
But, I mean,
definitely
you
does
make a good
aggravate the
point.
situation.
Yeah, and if I may, I think that another piece of this that's important to keep in mind is we're thinking about the predictability of a tax system, of a
Yeah.
tax base. So looking at it from the state level, and I know that Pat has slides moving forward, but come May, when I'm in here talking about the yields bill with all of you, we have a really, really good, we have the final grand list for that year. And the economists' estimates for how that grand list is going to grow. So we have a really, really good sense of what we're taxing. And that's why we can be, why it is so predictable, because we know
Mhm.
What it's gonna be.
really what it looks like.
The
Yeah,
other thing to remember is we have gone from a general fund transfer, which is general fund is primarily funded by the income tax, to all of the sales tax revenue. We were assured at that time that sales tax was no more vulnerable than the income tax. But when we did the general fund transfer, we were required to transfer X amount with an inflator. We are no longer required to do that. So if there is a major economic downturn, we are going to see a decline in sales tax revenue. After we put that in, we got the Wayfair decision. And then we had COVID. When we left here in June, the forecast was we had a $90 million deficit in the ed fund. When we came back after the federal stimulus all came out in the fall, we ended up, I think, with $150 million surplus. But it was purely, it wasn't property taxes that were bouncing around. It was the sales tax. People took those $2,000 stimulus checks and bought things. And plus we got paid for the online sales. And we did, looking back, artificially, I think, deflate the tax rate that would have been necessary. But those monies,
In the following 2 years, it was the income tax balloon.
yeah. So now we are here, but we have one more volatile tax. And if we go to an income, we will have two taxes that are probably volatile at the same time. So we will lose any cushion.
I do have slides on many of these points. as
Okay.
well.
oh, cool, let's keep going, sorry, I think we're off track.
No.
I will talk.
I guess sort of the overarching point, just to kind of take home with this is going back to something Julia said. Come May, you know what the tax base is, right? That you have to use for when you're talking about property taxes. And by May, you still don't know how much people are gonna make. And how much money is gonna come in. So for a self-balancing fund like this, there is, I don't wanna. I just want to emphasize the fact that by that time, there's a known tax base when you need to be doing some of those calculations.
It's how we end up with unanticipated revenue to buy down the property tax the last few years.
Is it?
But someday there will be an unanticipated loss. That has happened and that will happen again.
Here, I just want to emphasize the fact that, we had the state economists create these forecasts for personal income tax every year because it is somewhat volatile, and that's both to the good and to the bad. So, when this will become more of a theme going forward, but when the income tax beats expectations like it did, and out of the last 3 years, for this type of idea, that would be a boon to the education fund, right? But then there's also the downside years where it's not reaping the benefits of the, sort of healthier economy income market out there. So anyway, and you can just see that even with the forecast that they do, they update it twice a year, which, as a slight sidebar, went to a conference in October, and some states do a forecast for 2 years out and build a 2-year budget, which is crazy to me.
Up until that time, we did the forecasting. I think we're gonna have more money than we do this year. And we got into some trouble, it was before my time, doing that. This gives a solid number that both the governor and the legislature have to work with. And then there is the adjustment, which, but sometimes those adjustments can be pretty heavy swings.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And, you know, so anyway, the point to sort of make there is we have 2 economists come to this number, and you can see that it's probable that they never get it on the nose ever, right? Whereas when you talk about property taxes, you know, they have a forecast amount that we're expecting to raise, and we pretty much on the nose hit that amount every single year. So, you know, there's 2 kind of sides. There's the consistent, you know what you're getting, and there's the other one where you might win some years, you might lose some years in terms of expectations. So you actually mentioned recession or downturn in the market, and what I just want to look at here is what happens if we saw a similar size downturn that we saw in 2008 during the Great Recession. So if you're, sorry, I should back up just quickly for a second. For this income tax, you know, one way to get to a more predictable amount would be to do kind of what you do for the property tax credit and do an income look back. But then if you're also having an income tax for general fund purposes, is there maybe an incongruence between paying on your income for basically each of the last 2 years, basically having 2 bases for that income? And so that's just if we're talking income tax plus income tax.
Does anyone ever do that?
I would have to look into that.
I mean, I'm just thinking that the person that sells their Mickey Mantle baseball card ends up in that top bracket 1 year. If you were equalizing between that year and the year before when they were making 50,000, that would kind of smooth that bump out. But I have a feeling nobody else does it, and there's probably a reason why they don't.
I don't know if I can comment on that
Yeah.
specifically,
No, I
but
wouldn't expect it.
in the context of a 2008 style recession, if you were just basically tacking it onto current process, no look back, there would have been an estimated $170 million shortfall in the end fund in that year. 70 million of which would have been, and this is just proportional numbers based on what the downturn or percent decreases were at the time. 70 million of that would have been from the income tax alone, if that was what was being used instead of the non-homestead rate, or sorry, the homestead rate. And Julia did this quick math for me. If that was the downturn at the time, what impact would that have had on the non-homestead rate? And that would have equated to essentially a 20-cent tax rate increase, assuming that there were no reserves to forestall the shortfall. But like I said, on the other side, if you've got a great year and you beat expectations, you end up with a surplus in the fund, right? So it does work both ways.
And if you're disciplined, you can use your reserves and to offset.
Yeah.
If you're disciplined and lucky.
But if you have 3 good years, your discipline starts to slip.
Yes, exactly. We're not necessarily.
Which is how we got into that trouble. This is what I've been told. We used what was turned out to be one-time money to fund things like universal kindergarten. And then there was no one-time money. And I was here in another capacity, and you could feel the pain in the hall when you walked down it. And a lot of it was the governor said, no, we're not going to have this. And somebody, says, oh, my cousin works you know, the stock market, and he says it's gonna keep going up, and so we're gonna have X amount more, and we don't have to cut back this year until we did, and it was really painful. So having that revenue forecast is a good thing because it requires us to be disciplined. And that's a good thing when it comes to money.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess in a context of if you were to have more volatile tax type funding the system, something you'd want to think about is, does the existing reserve structure
Yeah.
make sense, or does that need to be made more robust to account for volatility? So this is, we're gonna look at three things here. First, I want to look at personal income tax collections sort of over the years, and you can see how certain business cycles do affect state revenue collections. So, you know, first dot-com recession saw about a 10% pullback in state collections. During the Great Recession, that was more like 20% decreases. And then I just wanted to highlight this one here because, you know, we talked about it in the last presentation, some of the changes that were made in 2022 that changed the tax code. And this is really just to highlight that your decisions in other areas of income tax could potentially have impacts. You know, it kind of, it's like a weed growing out. It will touch more areas if it's, you know, you have it funding a large portion of general fund services and also being a significant contributor to education expenses. So the impact in one area can affect another one. I think the idea of a balloon was brought up earlier.
The more we take property out of the mix,
Oh, that's true.
More. likely the more vulnerable we are to that. The more we rely on income-based taxes, the more vulnerable we are to swings. If we were funding education with income tax, that 10% drop or 5% drop would probably be double.
Yeah, and so I think that actually plays right into the slide you see here. Even during some of the, you see that the trajectory is much slower and doesn't exactly follow the same sort of cyclical things you see in something. And this is both to the good and the bad, right? It's both the ups and the downs. It's a much more smooth tied to property values, which again are known by the time you need to know them to set the rates. And then just another large component of the education fund is sales taxes. You can see again here that, you know, it doesn't get impacted by cyclical turns. But if you just compare that, to what we're looking at in the income tax slide, you see that those dips are not nearly as pronounced. You know, people still need to buy toothpaste.
Just on a credit card.
Exactly.
The store still gets. We still
I was
get
I might see that.
we tax sale.
Yeah.
If they buy a wallet, people need wallets.
There you go.
Isn't that public?
Toothpaste?
No,
I
that's,
don't know.
it's in one of the test slides.
Really?
I think we did.
Not menstrual products. I know that.
You're not going there.
We'll go there.
You want to talk more about that?
Look at that. That was my bill and it turned into a corporate
We
tax
started
bill.
that.
Yes, it did. I presented it on the floor 5 times. We are doing no more of those type of bills.
Okay, so right now I just want to sort of show how the breakout in revenue types sort of comprises Vermont state revenue. So, you know, part of the idea of sustainability is having a balance. So if you're underperforming in one area, it doesn't sink the whole ship, basically. You've got other sort of sources of support to keep revenue relatively consistent over time. And so this first chart you see here is basically where we were as of the tax study, which was done several years ago, which was sort of a deep dive on all the different ways that Vermont funds its government and how our tax structure is comprised. But you can see that there's a relatively even split or sort of balanced split here. 32% of state revenues was consumption, about 30% comes from property income, slightly lower at 23%, and then you got fees and other sort of more miscellaneous sources that make up the difference. So, we've got some that are a little bigger than others, but overall, we've got sort of a good mix or balance of income sources. But if the same analysis or the same report had been written in that year, 2015, under the assumption that we had replaced the non-homestead or the homestead rate with an education income tax. So this chart here sort of shows you how that shifts. So instead of income being sort of the third highest source of revenue, it becomes the highest source of revenue. So you're just sort of changing the dynamics of what is driving or sort of the balance of how the state collects. So like I said, important part of this pillar is balance. So if someone kicks out one leg of the stool, the whole thing doesn't come toppling over.
Can I ask, do these percentages, it's just state revenue. I was gonna say, does it include local municipal property taxes?
This is just how the state funds itself.
Okay.
Through revenue collections, and also doesn't include income.
Local is pretty much.
Heavy on-
Right, exactly. But I mean, so when we're talking about sort of, how much elasticity there is, in a property, in a tax, the property tax also has to take into consideration the municipal part of it.
Yeah, so these charts are only referring to sort of the state
Yeah.
actions, yeah.
Yeah, property only came into the mix with Act 60. Prior to Act 60, property was exclusively a local tax. And the locals were very reluctant to give any of it up to the state. Thus, there was a three-legged stool created. And I don't have my guru sitting next to me, so I can't give you details, but there was give and take to the locals, to business. The state now makes sure that the towns are fully paid for current use, which was another thing that didn't get fully funded when money got tight and the towns were left holding the bag. And there was a local machinery and equipment tax that got removed. Senator McDonald could do them in a litany, but there were trade-offs.
Yeah, so here I kind of just want to talk a little bit about, the relationship between growth in expenses and growth in revenue. I think again, this kind of comes back to the point of, income tax is not a sort of super predictable, measurable source of income every single year. We can estimate it, we can forecast it, we can get close. But with something like education, expenditures, for example, by December 1st, you've already have an estimate of what spending could look like. As you roll along, you get better information as schools have passed their budgets, which helps with that sort of more knowable understanding of what changes in spending and therefore what you need to have money for is going forward.
Knowable or noble? Noble or knowable?
Could be. I'm about to say knowable.
Knowable, okay.
How do we know?
I do too.
I have a tendency to mumble.
No, it's no subtle different.
So that's sort of our first pillar, sustainability, reliability. The next one that we usually talk about is fairness. And, you know, right off the bat, how do you evaluate fairness? You know, I think this is usually probably one of the hardest
It's in
pillars
the eye
to
of the beholder.
succeed at. But you know, on the one hand, you've got vertical equity, which is something you see in the income tax world. The greater ability to pay, the more taxes you end up paying. You know, that's why we have our marginal tax rate structure, and we provide things like credits and stuff like that to individuals at the lower income end of our range. You know, just as an example, again, we keep talking about Act 138 or IDA, right? From 2022, that was a relatively major shift. You even saw in that chart that I showed earlier, the dip or decrease in revenue being collected just because of some of the policy changes that were made in the NTC, child tax credit, things like that. But then with, if you think about property tax, so after accounting for property tax credit, which are modestly flat up to higher incomes, and then they become regressive. And I think we'll look at a chart either in this section or a later one showing you how sort of those effective rates change as your income changes. But one of the first things, you know, I said the first question is how do you evaluate fairness? To the first point on vertical equity, how do you even define ability to pay? How much we had, you know, there was some discussion prior to the break. How much should assets matter in that consideration? Should housing be treated differently than Mickey Mantle's rookie card? So yeah, like 300,000 worth of long-term bonds versus 300,000 worth of a house. You know, what should and what should not be sort of included in that? You know, like was said, houses are one aspect of the household wealth. For many people, it's the primary or most significant source of household wealth, but it's just one piece of a wealth tax, if that word was bandied up. Things like estate tax, property transfer tax do suggest an ability to pay for both, for the state tax anyway. State's got to be large enough to get over a certain threshold to own any, you know, sort of assuming that you're not going to be targeting smaller states with limited inheritance to whoever might be receiving it. It's really going after larger ones, which in theory should have more ability to pay. And yeah, like I said, year to year, there's a lot of churn in who are considered the highest income Vermonters. You know, there could be a lot of churn in that, but they're still in the same house, right? So their income might be changing quite significantly every year, but under the current system, I know recent years have maybe not been quite as similar to prior years, but it's a much smoother historically change year to year in the tax you pay, while your income might be very much more significantly. So yeah, that's so vertical equity, more ability to pay, more tax. Horizontal equity is basically just saying two taxpayers in similar circumstances should pay the same amount of taxes. And again, when you think about how do we define that? Two individuals who both make $50,000, but one lives in a $150,000 house and the other lives in a $400,000 house. I mean, would you consider that a similar circumstance? Both are making the same amount of income, but both are going to have, let's assume they live in the same town, because I know that matters. They're going to have very different property tax implications. So.
And we're contemplating changing that, are we? That last one?
The governor's proposal would impact person living, making $50,000 and living in the 400,000 because.
Right.
Yeah. But we only cover up to 250 now, the ramp.
No, so so under current law, households with incomes up to 90,000 can have a property tax credit on the first $400,000 of their home. Under the governor's proposal, it's that graduated homestead exemption. I think the other piece that's important to keep in mind here is that, the current law property tax system, you just because you're eligible for the credit does not mean that you receive the credit. The credit is given to a household if it were to be cheaper for them to pay off their income, rather than their property. So you have some folks where maybe they won't receive a property tax credit because it would be cheaper to pay off $1,000. But I think that the point that Pat makes here, is helpful to think about getting back to that horizontal equity. Should they be paying the same property tax
But if I bought
or the same tax?
the $400,000 house 50 years ago, and I bought the $150,000, property, and it really been skewed the last few years because we've gotten that huge bump, which should come down. That if you buy a house today, and that's the property transfer tax, it is assumed you can afford a $400,000 house. Anyone making $50,000 today could not buy a $400,000 house unless they have a trust fund. You pay down the money 1 year and then, you pay off the house and you can go back. And we had them, we used to send out rebate checks, sitting in front of their $500,000 condo on the hood of their Porsche. There's always somewhere it's going to be skewed, but in general, if you purchase a house in the last X number of years, that reflects your wealth. The problem we have now is we have a large number, we don't have $150,000 house for someone in the 400 to sell and move down to. And so we're kind of caught here in general. And so what's fair? And no, I mean, I don't think you can rate it as to how long have you owned your house, or do you have a mortgage on it? I've sold houses for people who have lived in them for 40 and 50 years, and they still have a mortgage because they did a home equity to travel. They took out a mortgage to pay for their kids' college.
Yeah.
And you will find that people who have lived in that house don't have the equity in it. Would assume they might have if they have paid off their mortgage 20 years ago. So what's fair?
So this is actually a chart I pulled from Nation Brief that First Manchester published a year or two ago. But what I really just want to highlight here is that wealth doesn't always equal income. And kind of building off of your comments, you can see that if you're talking about the top 1% of wealth holders, and this is national data, top 1% of wealth holders, I would have thought that they make up a greater share than 49% of top 1% of income holders. So just to orient you, each bar. So this first section here is just top wealth holders. So these 4 buckets here, and then you have the next, and then the next. How it's broken up on this chart is among top 1% of wealth holders, where do they fall in terms of top 1 or bottom 50% of income groups? So what this shows you is among top 1% of wealth holders, 49% of them are in the top 1% of income people. What I want to know is this top 1% of wealth holders. I want to know a little bit more about this 4% in the bottom 50% of income, because that's going to be, if you look at the U.S. nationally, that's going to be pretty low.
Yeah.
And these are all in percentiles, so that's basically the median and below includes 4% of 1% wealth holders.
Are those the people that live on borrowed money? Right, isn't that a practice that?
That is.
Yeah.
Or they own a lot of valuable property, but they're not making any, it's just fallow land.
Yeah, it's not income generating property.
It's not generating income.
Right.
But also, how are you defining income? Because is this adjusted gross income at the federal level, or is this net income, or is this just reported income? Because there are lots of ways that
So,
income doesn't get counted as income.
I will confirm, but, my look at this is that when we're talking about income groups here, this is going to be AGI. This is Federal Reserve Board data, which typically that would be the metric they would look at.
Yeah,
But I can confirm that. Wealth holders, that's Survey of Consumer Finance's survey data. So even when you're talking about that, and I've heard people talk about that survey before, that they get an undersample, honestly, of ultra wealthy people,
yeah.
because they don't necessarily want to disclose how much money they have or how many assets they have. So they do some statistical weighting to try and offset that. But anyway, the big thrust of the paper, honestly, was there's no good way to know how much wealth is held in the state of Vermont. Like when you're talking about all types of assets. So I just thought this was an interesting graphic.
Yeah,
Just
I mean, we've got
show you that
current
distinction.
use that can have some very valuable land. But it's not especially if it's forestry, it's not necessarily producing a lot of income. If at some point you take it out and it happens to be overlooking a nice lake, once you pay off your property taxes, you've got a valuable asset. But is that wealth or not wealth? And we're subsidizing it on the theory that it is equal wealth to the state to have open land preserved. Meets our social goals, so. Yeah.
Is this your graph or is this from somewhere else?
George Davis.
I just lately cannot figure out why. Shouldn't, if you add up all the top 1%, shouldn't that equal 100? And same with the next 9 and same with the next 40, but none of them do. One of them does.
I have it looks like it's rounding, some rounding there.
That means it's like top 1% of wealth holders have 49% of the top 1% income. And then for the next 9 is 5%. That's 54%. Where's the other 46%?
Wait, so 49 plus 41 is 90 plus 5 plus 4 is 99.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the between categories. 49% of the high income, top 1% income earners come from the top 1% of wealth. And 5% of the top 1% income come from the next 9 of wealth. That's 54. Where's the other 46?
Oh, you go 49, 5, 0, 0.
Yeah.
This,
Oh, okay. So thank you for saying that. So then the top section here, so this section is just looking of the universe. So it's not saying that 49%.
Oh, of income people within that
Yeah.
group. Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank
That's
you.
what I was not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because the groups are adding up to.
Okay, that's what I was not picking up on. Okay,
You're bringing back some
thank you.
night terrors that
I was just having a math fit there or something.
Joyce and I talked so much about how to produce that deep.
Okay,
Like,
okay.
it's just it's an odd graph, but I think it has
It's
some
all
interesting
within
information. in
each
it.
group. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, but as we go down.
Yeah.
We've got that top group. But the bottom 50% of wealth holders are in the bottom No, the income. They're in the,
Yeah,
where are they, where is that bottom 50%, which is 72% of that?
So the bottom 50% of wealth holders in that bucket,
Yes.
72% of them fall within the bottom. Yeah,
below the median?
Yeah.
Below the median, yeah,
Within the
okay.
median.
Yeah.
So they are,
so it's not saying that the bottom 50% of wealth holders, it's not just then saying, well, all of them have to be under below the median for income, right?
Yeah.
And some of them might have really low wealth, but they're slightly above the median here, so that's that 27% there that are in that next 40%. They might have very little.
okay, well, we're talking about wealth holders. We're not talking about the wealthy.
Yeah,
No,
and honestly,
That
some of
is
that like
figuring in everybody that owns their home.
that could include some student loan individuals who have good paying jobs, but they've got this big liability.
Well,
connected.
okay.
Yeah. So we looked at this a moment or in the previous slides, but again, just to highlight, within the personal income tax code, there's lots of ability for that vertical equity. Just saying that the more you're able to pay, the more you do pay. And so with property taxes, you do have that accounting for income that comes into play with the property tax credit. But again, like we discussed, it's a look back on income, and it doesn't necessarily it doesn't have nearly as many adjustments to what's counted in the income as you have in the personal income tax rates. I know it's household income, so it's a little different definition. But within the personal income tax code, we've got things like exemptions and credits and deductions, which is there's not really an analogous process that you have for the income that you use for the property tax, right? So again, talking about fairness in the tax, like I said, so it's flat for almost everyone except at the top. For most households, tax incidence is relatively flat. 96% of households in Vermont pay roughly 3% of their income on property taxes. And so where you love to see that.
Yes, it's that 0.44 that's getting everyone's attention.
Yep.
If that went up to 1.93 or 2, what would that generate? And is that the 87 million? Oh, but went up to 3, it would be the 87 million, right?
we paid 5.9 million. So,
So the only thing I don't know, so this is analysis from that study committee. It hasn't been
Okay,
like we didn't want to have to spend 2 days updating this. But so this is a little old, and I assume what was used was AGI for the income groups, but I don't know exactly. But
Yes,
okay, yes.
I can say one piece. I do apologize. I have to leave when I'm done providing context, even though I promised Pat I'd be here for the whole slide deck. But I do have a 4 o'clock meeting, but I will just say that here, the reason that it's looking at AGI and the reason that it's challenging and a lot of work to estimate, and we haven't updated it, is because we only have good data on income up to the upper limit of when someone may qualify for a property tax credit. That's when they're gonna disclose their household income on the property tax credit form. Above that, they don't disclose their income. So there's this really intense crosswalking of AGI data with grand list data to try to get at what the household income would be.
and the tax department can't tell you so-and-so in town X makes.
They could, and for them to do it in a couple days work.
Okay,
So,
Well, they couldn't tell you about the individual.
no.
yeah,
They can't tell you about
yeah.
the individual, that's what I mean. They could give you an aggregate. Okay,
So
Sorry to leave. I will come back when my meeting is over if you're still going.
you should. You probably absorb almost all the numbers we can absorb.
we'll be back tomorrow if you'd like to pause and pick up where we left off. I can finish this pillar.
Let's finish this section, yeah.
So, yeah, basically what I want to draw your attention to here, for the most part is, as you go up the income spectrum, you're actually having the opposite of what we saw in this chart. Whereas you go up, you pay more as in terms of, as an effective tax rate. Here, as you get up in income, the percent of your property tax compared to your total income actually goes down.
Yeah, and I think that's the chart that people are looking at. Even though the actual dollars may be higher.
Does that tax rate include the property tax credit on top, or is that just a gross tax bill, property tax bill?
Really perfect.
I know it.
It says total property taxes.
Yeah, it should be inclusive. Okay, so it should include. Yeah, so this column here should be capturing actual, out of pocket dollars paid.
Okay, out-of-pocket dollars.
Would account for that.
That third column, if you add it up, equals about what the homestead property taxes collected in that year were. Including the property tax credit.
With the
So
third column,
subtracting out the 168 million.
That's right. If you add up those numbers in the third column, they equal about what was collected from people after the property tax was collected.
oh, the third, okay.
Yeah.
I'm counting the columns different.
So I think it does include the property. tax
Okay.
credit.
Okay.
And
Let's keep going.
the more questions you ask me, I might take a sec to think about it. So I might pause after some questions too.
Okay,
So yeah, again, talking about fairness in the overall system. So here, what was done for that committee is sort of crosswalk. Okay, let's take what we saw here with the effective tax rates on the income. And let's combine that with what we see for effective tax rates in the personal income spectrum. So whereas before, if we looked at that chart with the average effective tax rate, you saw kind of a pretty increase over the income spectrum, right? What this in effect does when we combine those two, because this is decreasing with income and this is increasing with income, this flattens out quite a bit. And it's actually so pronounced, this is so pronouncedly smaller that, at this over 1 million, it actually does dip, whereas everything below that is increasing as the income goes up. But then once you get over 1 million, yeah, it actually dips when you combine both the personal income effective rate and the property tax effective.
so that's your overall tax burden.
Well, this is not accounting for things like sales tax.
No, but I mean,
other things.
for the two biggies, property tax and
For those,
income tax, when you put them together, you are paying less on the lower and more on the upper. We're still hitting those middle brackets, so, okay.
And I'll just make the point again that even if you doubled that effective tax rate for that group over $1 million, it only generates 5.9 million.
What'd you say?
That group, yes, they're at 6.49% and their average effective is 0.44.
Yeah.
If you double that 0.44, it only gets you $5.9 million.
If you double it on property,
Right, and
Yeah.
this is a table of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think we said
Well,
that we
it's not
put a
combined.
3% surcharge on there.
On property,
You, on your income,
that'll get you 90 million.
you get 87 million.
Yeah, over 500,000. That was the bill
Yeah.
last year, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
I was gonna say, we were talking about over 500,000 earlier.
right. On income.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The housing people have your head if you do that and send it to the education fund when we did go to for housing last year.
We're just getting you
it's a crazy.
bypassed the
Just-
system last year consistently, and the Senate helped with tradition and the primacy of the Appropriations Committee.
The backlog in school construction is between $6 and $9 billion. Just saying.
I know, but bottom line is we can't repair all those 60-year-olds.
That's right.
Some of them would be better off.
do not disagree with you.
The land is probably worth more than the liability in the building.
So,
Okay.
Madam Chair, we've gone through the pillar on fairness. This would be launching into another section. Pillar.
Committee, what's your pleasure?
I might be getting my second wind, so let's keep coming. I'll do whatever everyone wants to
You
do.
want to go to 4:30?
I'll be out of here in like 15.
You need to be out in 15 minutes. This is gonna take us more than
We
15,
could
right?
do 15 more minutes.
Looking-
That would be a middle ground.
Yeah, let's
between-
do 15.
I'll go for
We're
whatever.
halfway through this and are these Graham slides?
Yeah,
Yes.
we're at basically exactly the halfway.
Good old Graham.
This is probably a good time to quit then. I do remember Graham's slides and there's a lot of the columns and a lot of numbers. I don't remember what they are, but I do remember the
Is
slides.
he still in New
Yeah.
Zealand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Found out that if you stay there for 3 years.
Okay, yeah, we are.
Yeah.